Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Unfortunately, Cole was not able to make it today, but as they say, the show must go on, and I am fortunate enough to be joined here by Nick Hiebert. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Hiebert.
Hiebert?
Hiebert, yeah.
All right.
It's a German thing.
Okay. So yes, I'm very lucky to be joined here by Nick. Nick is someone who I've been following on Twitter for quite some time. If you're familiar with nutrition Twitter, interacting with a lot of the people on there, you may be familiar with Nick and his work. He has a super fantastic product called the Nutrient Density Cheat Sheet, which we will be talking about today, along with many other topics related to nutrition. So, Nick, provide everyone listening here with a little background about yourself.
Well, about 10 years ago, I took human nutritional science in university. I wasn't able to finish the degree, but I have at least a few credit hours under my belt. Spent the last decade pretty much in and out of kitchen, spent most of that time as a stay-at-home dad, but I've always been very interested in nutrition science, and I have an insatiable desire to expand my knowledge in that area. That's just like a brief summary of my background as it relates to nutrition.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's hop right into it and get into the nitty-gritty details of the nutrient density cheat sheet. So this is a product that I purchased maybe a couple months ago, and it's something I've had a ton of fun playing around with. I mean, this is truly a unique product. It's something that everyone could get a lot out of, but especially for the nutrition nerds, there's a lot to do with this thing. So tell us the story behind the nutrient density cheat sheet. Why did you make it? What were the underlying interests there, and how it's developed over time, as well as basically your formula for how you determine the nutrient density of a food.
Okay, so I originally created it as a means of saving money after I found myself unemployed. So I had a limited amount of money on hand and I needed to stretch it as far as possible. So what I did was I made a list of all of the foods that I typically eat or typically buy when I go grocery shopping. And I created kind of a sloppy measure of nutrient density that was based on the RDA kind of. It was a point system, like how many multiples of each nutrient of each nutrient relative to the RDA each food provided, and then I gave it some points based on those metrics, and then I got a kind of sloppy measurement of nutrient density, and then I found the price per 100 grams for all of the foods that I typically eat. I just divided one by the other, and then it spat out a score, and that's how I was able to save money when money was tight. But then somebody told me that there was like a community of people who like live for this kind of stuff, and it's a subreddit called Eat Cheap and Healthy.
Okay.
And Eat Cheap and Healthy, I put it on there, and it immediately got like 8,400 upvotes, like 2 platinum, 2 gold, like 3 silver, and it was pretty revered across the pond. But essentially what happened was there were a whole bunch of nutrition nerds on there who was like, and they were all like, well, hey, why don't you do it this way? Why don't you do it that way? You could tune this up. You could do this differently. Like, this looks sloppy. If you did it this way, it would look better. I basically took all of their criticisms and then just assumed that everybody was right and just integrated all of their criticisms. And that it ended up being a gigantic project with a lot of data in it. So now the product actually has, instead of a sloppy measurement of nutrient density, it is actually like as close to an objective measurement as you can get with the information that's available. So essentially the methodology is I take the nutrition per 100 grams and then I adjust it for serving size. And then from that, I then adjust on a nutrient per nutrient basis. I adjust it for bioavailability, nutrient absorption capacity, because some nutrients you can't absorb more than a certain amount at a given time. So I take that into account. If you exceed that amount per serving, then there's a cap placed on it. And then metabolic conversion inefficiencies. That's like the conversion of beta carotene into retinol, or perhaps even the conversion of pyridoxine into pyridoxal, like those types of things. And especially the essential fatty acids, I took that into account with those two. And then I take the nutrient yield after all of those adjustments are made, and I just divide the nutrient yield on a per nutrient basis by each nutrient's respective DRI. And then I sum the results across all nutrients, and then that becomes the score per food. And then I do that to all 650 foods on the cheat sheet, and then it stratifies them into a score. And that's how I measure a food's nutrient density. Because one of the problems that I had with normal nutrient density ranking systems was that they always arbitrarily dock points for quote unquote bad nutrients, and they arbitrarily give additional points for quote unquote good nutrients. So in the denominator on a typical nutrient density scale, you'll find things like calories, saturated fat, sodium, sugar, like all of the things that we consider quote unquote bad.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that unacceptable because it introduces an unacceptable level of bias into the results. It assumes that somebody will never want to consume sugar or sodium or saturated fat or up their calories. It always assumes that calories are a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
To put calories in the denominator assumes that calories are always to be kept low, but to me that's a separate consideration. And there's somebody else who did a nutrient density scale similar to the one that I made. His name's Matt Lalonde, and he also made the same point. You have to consider calories separately because they're a separate consideration. One of my nutrient density scores, the bodybuilding score, actually gives additional points for calories. The higher a food is in calories, the more points it assigns to the food. So what I wanted was a minimally biased scale from which to base all of my other scores. And that's the total nutrition score on the spreadsheet. Like that's actually like just the master score is called the total nutrition score. And that is just the nutrient density of a food, which includes essential vitamins, essential minerals, amino acids, and fatty acids. And fiber. I put the DRI for fiber in there because I was persuaded to do so by a vegan. She made a compelling enough case. She made a compelling enough case to me about fiber that it should be included. And the reason I included it was because I knew it was going to do sweet piss all to the results because it's only one nutrient out of about 33 nutrients that I've aggregated into the score. So it wasn't really going to move the needle terribly much in one direction or the other. So I decided to include fiber as well.
That's absolutely incredible. The whole system underlying this product is truly remarkable. You can tell there's a lot going on here. There's a lot that's considered, and it all plays into just the accuracy of what this tool provides when somebody's trying to use it to basically select foods and construct their overall diet. So with that being said, Nick, give us a little insight into the top 10 most nutrient-dense foods, generally speaking.
Okay, so the way I would do this is instead of actually listing individual foods, I would stratify by category.
Okay.
Because there are so many foods within a category that are so similar that it's not really it's questionable whether or not it's meaningful to draw distinctions between them, like chicken liver versus beef liver, for example.
Yeah.
So I put them all in categories. So from top to bottom, it's organ meats, muscle meat, seafood, eggs, soy, processed meat, processed food, milk products, seeds, and legumes.
So when we look at these general categories, and especially like in that top 5 right there, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of animal products, which I think may be surprising to some people, depending on, how well versed in nutrition they are, because all we generally hear is about how healthful fruits and vegetables are. These are where the majority of the micronutrients in your diet is going to come from. The more you eat of these things, the better. They basically dictate how healthy your diet is. You know, you eat a lot of these things, you have a healthy diet. You don't eat that many, well, then you probably have a nutrient poor diet. So I'd like to kind of take this a little bit further and basically, can you tell us about some general differences in the nutrient content of plant and animal foods? I think we can agree that the optimal diet likely combines both of these things, but we're living in crazy times where, you know, especially if you're part of nutrition Twitter, you know, you have the carnivore diet tribe, people who only eat meat, you know, not as crazy, but you also have the vegan tribe, and, you know, everything they eat comes from plants. So tell us a little bit about the general differences in the nutrients which can be found in meats and in plants, and then we'll kind of dive into those two specific diet tribes I just referenced.
So the most salient difference between animal foods and plant foods or non-animal foods um, is that there are certain nutrients that have diminished bioavailability. There are certain nutrients that suffer from conversion inefficiencies and whatnot. I think in the aggregate there isn't too much of a practical difference. Like, I think in terms of protein, there probably is a major practical difference between the two foods. But like, if you were to pick a random nutrient like folate, is it really better to get folate from liver than lentils? I don't really think so. Is it better to get B1 from pork or instead of lentils or chickpeas or whatever? No, I don't really think so. There are probably like there are salient differences. So, for example, like vitamin B6 is much harder to get from plant foods. Sorry. So from plant foods, vitamin B6 is found as pyridoxine and is bound up in this sugar called pyridoxine glucoside. And you're completely at the mercy of your gut microbiome to like cleave this thing apart to liberate the pyridoxine. And then you got to absorb it. Then it's got to go to the liver. Then it has to undergo this metabolic conversion. So there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of points of failure. Whereas if you were to just eat the animal food, you get straight pyridoxal 5-phosphate and it goes straight to the liver and it's not at the mercy of any particular one of these steps in order for you to absorb it and utilize it. So on a practical level, though, it hasn't really been persuasively demonstrated that people who rely entirely on plant foods are limited in terms of B6 status. Like, their B6 status is on average lower, but still within a tolerable range. So it hasn't really been demonstrated that it's limiting. And you could say that for most of the nutrients of concern, or most of the nutrients that are of typical concern when comparing omnivorous and vegan diets, for example. Like, there's vitamin A, so beta carotene or carotenoids to retinol. No, it hasn't really been persuasively demonstrated either that somebody who's relying completely on that conversion is necessarily limited. So I don't think that that's a very practical concern either. Vitamin K is another one that's cited a lot, and I actually don't think that one's very practical either, because it really depends on, it could be, because most people don't eat plant sources of vitamin K2, for example. So like, vitamin K from leafy greens is incredibly it's not very bioavailable. It's one of the least bioavailable nutrients that I measured or that I found data on. And there isn't a whole heck of a lot of vitamin K2 in vegan foods, but there is some. Like, you could eat natto if you can stomach it. So I think vitamin K might be of a practical concern when you're comparing the two diets, like an omnivorous diet versus a vegan diet. There are some concerns with anti-nutrients in plant foods like oxalate and phytate, but again, at least in the Western world, it hasn't really been demonstrated that those things are limiting for things like iron and zinc status. So I'm not terribly persuaded that it really matters a whole heck of a lot. Like most of the data on iron deficiency anemia and zinc deficiency come from India, actually, and come from like other like impoverished nations where they don't really have access to high quality food or even high quality, higher quality processed food and things like that that could help somebody along with those types of things. Like in the Western world, when we measure vegans' iron status, like, yeah, it's lower. Like their iron their iron stores are typically lower, but they're still within tolerable. They're still within the tolerable range. So I don't know if that's particularly limiting. But yeah, there are salient differences between animal foods and plant foods. Like you can't get B12 from plant foods, and you can't get vitamin C to a meaningful degree from animal foods. So I think that the two food categories are complementary. If anything else, they're complementary. It's best to have both.
Absolutely. So you touched a little bit on the quote unquote anti-nutrients within plant foods. And this is something that you'll see, followers of the carnivore diet kind of come at plant-based diets about. And they'll say, well, your foods contain anti-nutrients, or how could it ever make sense from a natural perspective to consume foods which, basically possess anti-nutrients in them? That could never be good for you. It sounds like based on the data and what you're saying that it's not a concern. So there may be some sort of inhibition going on as far as your ability to absorb these nutrients, but at the end of the day, it's not really going to make an impact on whether you're able to get enough or meet the RDA for vitamins and minerals, these anti-nutrients.
I think on an individual basis, it's something to keep in mind, and it's definitely something to be concerned about. But on a population level, it seems to be a non-issue in Western cultures. That's the point that I was trying to get at. So, like on an individual basis, everybody has to monitor their nutritional status to make sure that they're not running deficient in anything. And if you find out that the ratio of phytate to iron is too high in your diet and you're becoming anemic, you have to do something to correct that. But on a population level, it seems like most people don't encounter that problem. But that's not to say that some people don't encounter the problem, because some people very likely do encounter that problem. I could very easily design in less than 2 minutes a vegan diet that would leave somebody anemic. I mean, I could do the same thing with an omnivorous diet. So it's something that everybody has to keep in mind.
So what other things are we keeping in mind specifically? So you mentioned that this relationship between phytate and iron. What other anti-nutrient relationships are there?
So the primary ones of concern that most people talk about are phytate and oxalate. And really, it depends on the molar ratio of that. That means on a molecule per molecule basis, how much of each you have in a particular food or in your diet. So like the molar ratio of iron to phytate or calcium to oxalate will determine how bioavailable either the iron or calcium are. So it's not actually just the presence of phytate that poses a problem, because like, for example, the bioavailability of iron in chickpeas is actually pretty good when it's measured, but there is phytate in chickpeas. But it doesn't seem to be limiting for iron absorption from chickpeas. So it's not the mere presence of phytate that is the problem. It's the molar ratio of phytate to iron that's in the food. Same thing with oxalate. It's the ratio of oxalate to calcium that defines how bioavailable the calcium is. So, for example, with like leafy greens, so take broccoli for example, it has oxalate in it, but the bioavailability of calcium from broccoli is actually better than milk. It's better than bones. So the oxalate that's in broccoli doesn't seem to be particularly limiting for the bioavailability of that calcium. So those are the two anti-nutrients that are typically talked about. There are others, but they're more esoteric. Like there's a whole bunch of different polyphenolic compounds that also inhibit iron absorption, but they're less studied and they're less well understood.
Got it. So it sounds like, as long as a vegan is putting some decent thought into their diet, these anti-nutrients really aren't going to impede their ability to be healthy, as opposed to potentially the carnivore gang. Nick, tell us, can you meet all of your nutrient needs through an all-meat diet?
I think if your only concern is getting the baseline amount of nutrition in order to stave off just like frank deficiency syndromes, then I think yeah, you could probably get everything you need from a carnivore diet. But I mean, like Chris Rock said this best: you could drive you could drive a car with your feet if you want to. That doesn't make it a good idea. Like, so you could meet all of your nutritional needs depending on how you define nutritional needs on a carnivore diet. Hey, you could even meet your fiber requirement on a carnivore diet if you're willing to eat insects. Like that's not limiting if you're willing to eat bugs. But if you sit down with 90% of carnivores, they're not going to be willing to put a cricket in their mouth. So can you meet your nutrient needs? Yeah, but there's a huge difference. So like on a carnivore diet, it would be typical to get anywhere between 5 and 10 milligrams of vitamin C. And I wrote a huge blog article on vitamin C. It's probably still one of my largest blog articles on any nutrient or any topic. And you can keep scurvy at bay with 6.5 milligrams of vitamin C a day. That's not a whole heck of a lot. But the DRI for vitamin C is not based on keeping scurvy at bay. It's based on your antioxidant status, and it's based on a huge amount of data regarding vitamin C's use by the body as an antioxidant. So it participates in the antioxidant system alongside vitamin E and glutathione, and it's partially mediated by riboflavin and NAD. So you could get enough vitamin C to like keep your collagen synthesis going, but in order to keep your antioxidant system going at peak efficiency, at maximal capacity, you're really not going to get enough on a carnivore diet unless you supplement. So is it enough to meet your essential needs? Yeah, probably. Is it enough to be completely and 100% optimal? I'm doubtful. Probably not.
Any other nutrients as far as carnivore diet goes where you might be meeting like these very, very base level needs, but as far as optimizing that nutrient, you're probably not going to happen?
Oh, as far as optimizing goes,
Well, pretty much most, right?
As far as optimizing goes, like you're pretty much cutting out at least 154 well-studied, or at least reasonably well-studied polyphenolic compounds that all target different pathways and all have different positive effects on the body that have been studied and well understood, and at least for a handful of them. But there's like somewhere around 5,000 different polyphenolic compounds in plant foods. And assuming this is the problem with these diets that are completely restrictive. If you cut out all plant foods, you completely cancel the opportunity of benefiting from anything that those plant foods have that isn't well characterized at this time or well understood. You may be keeping yourself from benefiting from nutrition that you don't know about, that nobody knows about. Same thing with cutting animal foods out of your diet. There may be characteristics that animal foods have that you'd be missing out on if you just cut them completely out of your diet. Even if those benefits aren't well characterized or well understood, you're still leaving open the possibility that you are making yourself vulnerable. So as far as optimizing goes, I would try to get probably a 50-50 mix, or at least a 75-25 mix in favor of plant foods. I'm more biased towards plants generally. I mean, I do eat a significant amount of animal foods. They probably comprise about 50% of my calories, but like only 25% of my plate or less usually. Like I had like tofu and chilies for breakfast. But yeah, in terms of optimal functioning, I think you do want a mix. But then again, there are people out there, and I do believe these people when they say this. I do believe that there are some people out there who are just sensitive to certain compounds that are found in most plant foods.
Mhm.
And I do believe some of the people out there when they say that they genuinely feel better and perhaps are even function optimally. I leave open that possibility, but I think most of the people who make that claim are just, if I have to be perfectly honest, they're probably just falling victim to the placebo effect, or
Right.
even the nocebo effect. And the same thing with a vegan diet. Like, I had a conversation with a guy a couple of years ago who swore that his erectile function got better when he cut out animal foods, and it's like, well, that could just be a calorie restriction effect, because we know that that has an effect on that particular endpoint. So if you're eating a lot of calories on an omnivorous diet and then you cut out animal foods and then spontaneously restrict your calories, you might get that effect. That's not to say that you're getting that effect because you cut out animal foods. You might be getting that effect because you just reduce calories. And I would extend this to most carnivores as well. Can you really say for certain that you're not just getting a calorie restriction effect? The thing is that they're probably getting a calorie restriction effect without feeling deprived, and that's the salient difference. It's like, oh, I tried calorie restriction and it didn't work for me. Well, okay, that's great. And it didn't work for you because you tried to restrict calories and you felt deprived, and then you started to binge eat. And when you go carnivore, you can eat to satiety and you don't feel deprived because the food is satiating to you. But that doesn't negate the calorie restriction aspect of it. Like, it's a calorie restriction just by itself is a powerful intervention.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As far as your general stance goes, I'm in complete agreement. We should probably prioritize the majority of our diet coming from plants. Um, and then also in regards to people on carnivore, we have no research whatsoever on it, let alone, long-term research of what this could potentially do to someone's health. But at the end of the day, N=1 holds some value, and if someone feels like their life and their health has been completely changed by following this diet, you can talk about the potential concerns and the potential for vitamin mineral deficiencies and this and that. But if they're feeling great, who am I to tell them that they're wrong and their lifestyle and choices are completely ridiculous when they feel like they're on top of the world?
Yeah, I mean, and there are some people who are probably feeling great and seriously harming themselves at the same time.
Yeah.
Most of the people who follow Dave Feldman's work have LDL particle numbers that are like sky high, and they all feel great. But
we could have a whole another podcast episode about Dave Feldman and what he's doing. We addressed a little bit of that LDL hypothesis of his on our past episode with Dr. Ethan Weiss, and
oh yeah,
yeah, I don't think he's a big fan of
no,
that one.
he's kind of skeptical.
Yeah, he's a little skeptical to say the least, and the amount of people he has to go through on Twitter who are contacting him saying that it's not that big of a deal, and well, we'll look at Dave Feldman's work, and
Yeah,
the amount of questions he gets on a daily basis about that, I'm sure it seems like it's driving him a little bit crazy.
but yeah, that could certainly be an entire other podcast right there.
Following down this rabbit hole of nutrient density of foods and the potential implications of nutrients interacting with one another, could you give us kind of your top 5 list of foods which are commonly recommended for being very rich in a particular nutrient, but they might not actually be so for a variety of reasons, and then also kind of give us a food which kind of flies under the radar for that nutrient, but it is a really great source of it.
Okay, yeah, I put some thought into this, and I think I'm going to tailor this specifically toward nutrition Twitter.
Love
So
it. Love it.
the first thing on the list that I have is leafy greens,
Okay.
often touted as an excellent source of vitamin K,
Yeah.
but it isn't. On average, leafy greens, when eaten just by themselves, have very poor vitamin K bioavailability. They are loaded with vitamin K, but it is incredibly difficult to actually absorb it. at least when you are eating leafy greens by themselves. Probably the bioavailability increases when you add fat. I would be shocked if it didn't. But when you just eat leafy greens by themselves, they're not a very good source of vitamin K. Other foods that are actually really good sources of vitamin K that you might not expect are natto, which is a fermented soybean product, cheeses, dark poultry meat, and pretty much any kind of pork. Those foods are incredibly high in vitamin K, and I was shocked to find that out, but data's data, and they're incredibly high in vitamin K. The next food on the list is fruit. For the reason, and it is, okay, so fruit is typically touted as a good source of vitamin B6.
Okay.
But as I was discussing earlier, the vitamin B6 that's in fruit is bound up to sugar-like molecules that you need to break away and liberate. And when they've measured bioavailability of B6 in certain fruit, it could be as low as 15% and as high as, I think, somewhere around 60%. So the bioavailability of B6 from fruit is actually not too great. If you wanted highly bioavailable B6, you could go for liver, cockles, fish, or any kind of muscle meat. Pretty much any kind of muscle meat is high in B6. And this next one is going to piss some people off. Animal fat. Animal fat, in general, is not a good source of fat-soluble vitamins. You hear all the time from carnivore and paleo people that it's just the animal fat is just loaded with fat-soluble vitamins. No, the fat-soluble vitamins are actually found in the cellular compartments of the muscle tissue to a greater extent than they are found in the adipose tissue of the animal. So leaner cuts of meat are actually higher in fat-soluble vitamins than the fat portion of the meat. And I know that's very counterintuitive, but it's true. There are a few choice foods that are high in most fat-soluble vitamins, if not all fat-soluble vitamins. There are some exceptions. So to get the most fat-soluble vitamins at once, there are a few foods that you could eat. So avocados, carrots or carrot juice, or any kind of ungulate liver. Also, fish liver is pretty high in the range of fat-soluble vitamins. But there is an extra consideration that came up in the data as I was preparing for this. Most classic British food, like most classic recipes, or not even British, but like most classic recipes are high in all of the fat-soluble vitamins as well, like shepherd's pie, chili con carne, like most foods that have a meat component but are whole recipes are actually a really good source of all fat-soluble vitamins, provided that they're made with the right ingredients. You usually like carrots and meat and whatnot. But like classic recipes that you grew up with, those are actually pretty good sources of fat-soluble vitamins, I found based on my data. Another one is going to piss people off as well, and that's bone broth. Bone broth is not a good source of calcium. Stop saying that. People who say that bone broth is a good source of calcium need to just stop saying that. It's not. And if you want a good source of calcium, there are a few options. Dairy products or dairy substitutes, edible bones, tofu, and leafy greens are all really good sources of calcium, but not bone broth. Bone broth is a really good source of like glycine and protein in general and electrolytes, but not calcium as as one electrolyte that's kind of singled out as not being represented after you make the bone broth. It's actually really low in calcium.
Yeah, bone broth is kind of like the like 2020 version of coconut oil. Like people aren't really sure about it, like what's actually in it, but they're like, it's great for everything. It's magic.
Yeah. Okay, so another one is nuts and seeds. So nuts and seeds, people have a tendency to actually assume or think that nuts and seeds are high in protein. My parents are bad for this. I'm going to meet my protein requirement with peanuts. It's like, okay, Mom, all right, sure. And I don't know I don't have the heart to tell you that that's not the way it works. Okay, so nuts and seeds are closer to being a fat source than a protein source.
Absolutely.
They have a very, very poor macronutrient profile if what you care about is protein. They're fat sources. They're not protein sources. If you want some protein sources, you can go for protein isolates, meat, legumes, or eggs. To a lesser extent, cheese, but even cheese and nuts, they kind of have a similar macronutrient breakdown depending on the cheese that you're selecting. Which actually leads me to want to talk about one particular thing. Like full fat ground beef actually has like the same macronutrient breakdown as like macadamia nuts. Like so like full fat ground beef isn't a good protein source either. It's closer to being a fat source. So like there, in terms of judging where somebody should be getting their protein from, people often make the mistake of thinking things like nuts and seeds and full fat ground beef are good sources of protein, but they're not. So that would be like the top 5 list of foods that people typically get wrong in one way or the other.
Fantastic. Yeah, super fascinating stuff. I especially like the point about the nuts and seeds. I'm highly involved in the sports nutrition realm of things. Part of my dietetic internship, I was with the University of Maryland football team. And still, in the sports nutrition world, we talk with these athletes about getting in high protein foods to support recovery, what they're doing on the field, and what they're doing in the gym. And peanut butter still gets pushed all the time as being like this top tier protein food, like maybe for, meeting these very high calorie needs that these athletes have, but don't be pushing it solely as a source of protein because it is, as you mentioned, very poor for that.
Yeah, I mean, like if you really wanted like the most bang for buck, like shrimp or tuna are like some of the only whole food protein sources that are almost all protein. Like they have very, very little fat and no carbs, of course. But like they're almost all protein. So like almost every single gram of what you're eating, other than the water content, is like protein. It's crazy. No, it's tuna and shrimp.
Very good. So speaking of protein, with the nutrient density cheat sheet, you can sort foods by their general nutrient density. You can sort by specific vitamins and minerals. But you also have some very specific categories. One of those is the bodybuilding category.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how you develop the score for how good of a food is for bodybuilding.
So the bodybuilding score takes the total nutrient density and multiplies it by protein, leucine, and carbohydrates and calories. And it weighs them all differently, and it also gives additional points to protein completeness. And protein completeness is calculated by assessing the variation in amino acids relative to the DRI for each amino acid. So the more variation there is in amino acids, the less it is considered a complete protein. All of the amino acids are exceeding one multiple of each amino acid's DRI, then it's considered a complete protein whether or not there's variation like above that. But if you have a protein source and it's just missing one amino acid, it's going to get a terrible score. I've calculated it so that incomplete proteins get a terrible score. And the more complete a protein is, the better the score that it yields. And the results that it spat out are actually pretty congruent with common recommendations around how to structure your protein intake for maximizing like muscle hypertrophy. So like at the very top of the list is like whey protein.
Okay.
I mean, like the way I calculated it, the number, it just spat out whey protein. So I'm like, hey, maybe I calculated it correctly because that's like that's what everybody recommends. So like whey proteins like at the very top, and seitan, which is a type of it's a wheat protein isolate, is also up there. Quest bars, like protein bars, are also up there, followed mostly by like poultry and then liver. And because it's multiplied by nutrient density, you also get the most amount of protein. So like all of the things that are conducive to muscle hypertrophy, you get that multiplied by the nutrient density score. So it also considers how nutritious something is. So the top of the list is pretty much all animal foods except for the concentrated plant proteins like seitan and soy protein isolate. One of the foods that's actually near the top of the list, it gets a 10 out of 10, is pizza. Pizza gets a 10 out of 10 because if you think about it, it's loaded with carbohydrates, it's loaded with protein, it's loaded with calories. How could it not get a good score the way I calculated it? So the way I calculated it, it almost was destined to get a good score, right? Mm-hmm. Some other foods, like there's legumes on there, but mostly it's just animal foods. Like I'm scrolling down, everything from 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 to 8 out of 10 is pretty much 99% of it is animal foods. You don't really encounter non-concentrated, non-animal foods until maybe about 8 out of 10. Then you start getting wheat germ and pumpkin seeds and nutritional yeast and hemp seeds, watermelon seeds, and then the cheeses are also on there. Because some of the cheeses actually, depending on how aged they are, do have a carbohydrate content. So the ones that have a higher carbohydrate content are favored on that list. So yeah, that's how the bodybuilding score is calculated.
So you mentioned the role of carbohydrate when you set up this score for these bodybuilding foods. I think many people would have assumed that foods high in protein would have been towards the top of the list, but not, inevitably carbohydrates. So you recently wrote an article on nutritional ketosis and muscle hypertrophy. This is something that we talked about with Cliff Harvey on our first podcast episode that we kind of put on streaming platforms. And we talked about maximizing muscle hypertrophy on a ketogenic diet. And, based on the research and what we talked about with Cliff, we see that performance is not negatively impacted per se on a ketogenic diet. As far as, anaerobic performance, you can definitely still improve with a lack of carbohydrate in the diet. And, considering training performance kind of guides the majority of what we're looking at in regards to accumulating muscle hypertrophy. And then we also have some data showing that post-workout muscle protein synthesis is not enhanced with carbohydrate on top of adequate protein. Overall, we concluded that in order to maximize muscle hypertrophy, it's probably a good thing to have some carbohydrate in there. But based on these results that I just mentioned, that you can definitely still accumulate more than sufficient muscle hypertrophy on a ketogenic diet. So tell us about the role of carbohydrate. Is there just something physiologically that they do? Just, they might not impact MPS per se. They might not specifically impact performance to a large enough degree to inhibit muscle hypertrophy. But is there something else just generically within the body that they do which could enhance or preserve muscle mass?
So my argument that I was trying to get across in my article, and I wouldn't disagree with anything that you just said. I wouldn't disagree with anything that you just said. But the argument that I was trying to get across in my article was not that you need carbohydrate for gains or even that carbohydrate are uniquely anabolic, because I don't believe that. They're not uniquely anabolic. But however, the absence of carbohydrates is uniquely catabolic. So when you don't have carbohydrate in the diet, you, to some extent, unless you compensate in other ways with protein, you are losing anabolic potential. The protein that has to go toward building muscle, or it has to go toward making glucose. And you can't have it both ways. So when you are in a ketogenic state, unless you're eating commensurately higher protein to compensate, you are necessarily losing anabolic potential by restricting carbohydrate, because those amino acids that you're consuming got to go somewhere, and glucose isn't free. So somebody who's on a high carb, high protein diet could potentially be able to use more amino acids for muscle hypertrophy and not gluconeogenesis. So that was the argument that I was making, was merely that if you're restricting carbohydrates, you are going such that you probably just need to increase your protein. And once you've increased your protein intake to compensate for the difference, there's probably no difference between muscle hypertrophy and ketosis and muscle hypertrophy on a non-ketogenic diet. However, I think muscle hypertrophy probably would be easier from a practical standpoint on a carbohydrate inclusive diet, because then you would have some of that muscle sparing effect that you can't really get from fat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that covers it. Moving on into another one of your specialized scores, one that I'm actually probably more interested in right now, considering I'm in the middle of a bodybuilding contest prep. So when I hear about the bodybuilding scores for foods, and you're telling me that a pizza is 10 out of 10, I'm a little disheartened right now, because pizza is definitely not part of my diet.
Yeah.
At the moment, but this you have a score for basically the satiety index of a food, more or less. So you call this the Stephan Guyenet score, who is a fantastic researcher within the nutrition field. He has a great book called The Hungry Brain, something I've read. Tell us about the Stephan Guyenet score, what that means, how it's calculated, and some of the most satiating foods.
So I called it the Guyenet score. I didn't call it the Stephan Guyenet score because I didn't want to use his whole name. I still haven't talked to him about my use of his name with this score. I have no idea if he'd be okay with it or not. But the score basically takes the satiety index of a food, multiplies it by protein, and then divides it by calories. And what it yields is a stratification of foods that are highest in protein and satiety factor and lowest in calories, which, from my understanding, is kind of what Stephan Guyenet recommends. I mean, he would probably, I could probably go back and forth with him about the most correct way to calculate the score, but that's just a simple calculation that yields a relatively clean and consistent stratification of foods that seem relatively in line and concordant with his recommendations. So, for example, you said you were disheartened because of the score that pizza got, and pizza's off limits.
Yeah.
Here's the thing: you could sort the bodybuilding score.
Okay.
Or you can sort the entire spreadsheet by the bodybuilding score and then just line up pizza, and you actually see that pizza has a great bodybuilding score but a terrible Guyenet score. So although it's probably good for muscle hypertrophy, it's probably not good for muscle hypertrophy. It's probably not good for satiety. It's probably not good for optimizing the satiety factor of your food. Getting the most amount of protein and the most amount of satiety for the least amount of calories, it fails at that miserably. So this is one of those instances where you can cross-reference two scores in order to get more nuanced answers. So if I was to go down the bodybuilding score and just keep on going down until I saw a high score for the Guyenet score, I would find perhaps, let's see, Rabbit. Rabbit has a high Guyenet score and a high bodybuilding score. So if you're into eating rabbit, I mean, that's fine. Another one is yellowfin tuna. So tuna I mentioned earlier as being a really good food that's high in protein. Another one's ostrich, snapper. Another one is emu. I don't know where the hell you would buy emu, but it's on here. So yeah, the strength of the cheat sheet is being able to cross-reference multiple scores at a glance so that you can optimize your goals, right? So say you want to save money, lose body fat, and gain muscle and maximize your nutrition all at the same time. You could go to the cost efficiency score, because I have price data aggregated into here too. You can go to the cost efficiency score, sort the spreadsheet, and then just line up line up the scores for whatever suits your values at that moment. So lose fat, gain muscle, save money, and get a lot of nutrition. Some of the options that actually line up quite nicely for that are, let's see, beef heart, chicken hearts, beef liver, bacon, goose eggs, 2% milk. Like you can line up and cross-reference cells so that you can optimize food selection. And that's one of the most powerful ways to use this thing. And using this thing could be as simple or as complex as you like. There are millions of ways to cross-reference the data, but just looking at the total nutrition score, if you just wanted to know, hey, on a qualitative basis, which foods are more nutritious than others, you can just sort it by the total nutrition score and just look at it and be like, okay, I want to pick that food over that food. And that's a very simple way to use the spreadsheet that's perfectly valid. Mm-hmm. And if you want to get more nuanced, you can sort it by the low carb score, which is the most amount of nutrition for the least amount of carbs, or the high protein score, which is the most amount of nutrition and the most amount of protein for the least amount of carbs and fat together. So that's like the Ted Naiman score, I guess you could call it. There's a whole bunch of scores. I think there's like over 50, 60 different scores. If you include all of the macros and vitamins and minerals, amino acids, and miscellaneous scores, there's a whole whack of data here that people can sift through. And I've definitely spent hours looking at this, and I've had feedback from a few of my customers being like, dude, I've looked at this thing for hours. Even Zach Bitter contacted me and he was like, dude, I used your spreadsheet to have the best season of my career. And I was like, wow, that's really gratifying.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I've definitely spent some time playing around with this. For anyone who listens to the podcast and follow my work, you know that I was recently experimenting with the ketogenic diet using Nick's nutrient density cheat sheet. I got to play around with that, and kind of it helped me maximize the nutrient density of a ketogenic diet, because there are some potential nutrients of concern if you really don't plan out what you're doing with that. And then like some of the sections that we just touched on, considering in the middle of bodybuilding contest prep, I have looked at, the GNA score. And again, you can cross-reference for looking at, sources which are great for bodybuilding and also great for satiety, but also just generally satiating foods in general. And looking at that list has definitely helped me, make my diet a little more satiating, make the suffering a little bit less throughout this process. But there are so many ways you can utilize this sheet. There's just a ton of information. Like Nick said, you really can spend hours if you want to nerd out with this thing. But that basically wraps it up for all the questions I have for you, Nick. So tell the people a little bit where they can find more information about you, where they can purchase the nutrient density cheat sheet.
Okay, so I spend most of my time on Twitter, or at least most of my contact through social media is on Twitter. So that's probably the best place to contact me. I am available to receive messages if people want to chat with me. That's fine. And it's at @the_Nutrivore, and that's my Twitter handle. So you can find me on Twitter, and from Twitter, you can find links to pretty much everything: the nutrient density cheat sheet, my blog, my Patreon. Anything else that's of interest that connects me with social media, you can find through my Twitter. So that's probably the best place to find me.
And I highly, highly suggest following Nick on Twitter if you're interested in nutrition and you have a Twitter. Just the amount of information he puts out on there, and the very intriguing debates he gets into on a regular basis. I can honestly say I've learned a lot from following Nick, and it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me today, Nick. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, no problem. It's been a pleasure, dude.
All right.